So I thought it would be interesting to have a look at what other countries are doing before I finally get to the answer to the question that I've been teasing you with. Everyone goes on about Europe and how environmentally friendly it is in comparison. Well, Germany, not so much. They pulled the plug on their last nuclear reactors in 2023 because public opinion over there just never really recovered after Fukushima, and the Greens essentially made pulling out of nuclear a political must-do, which I think was an odd choice. The catch, of course, is that they've had to burn more coal, their emissions have gone up, and the gap is now closing because they have upped their renewables, but they did emit more coal than really they needed to. If you go back to France, they did the opposite. They have about 56 reactors. They get more than 2/3 of their electricity from them, and they're building another 6. Their logic is pretty simple. Keep emissions low and avoid Russian gas. The United States, of course, has the most reactors, sitting at 92. They supply about 1/5 of US electricity and half of its cleaner power. Most plants are being re-licensed for another 60 to 80 years because if they turn them off, their emissions would spike like you wouldn't believe, which isn't really something I feel like their political environment cares about too much at this precise moment. But we'll see. They have plans to build some new large reactors. As I mentioned earlier, they have been a bit of a financial nightmare. So they are bidding quite big on the small modular reactor thing. Bill Gates is even getting involved with something called TerraPower. I mean, if those things hit their targets, that could be very interesting. I talked about China and its renewables earlier. It's not taken about with nuclear either. They have more solar panels than the rest of the world combined. They have gigawatts and gigawatts of on and offshore wind, and they are building a steady stream of new reactors too. I think it's one every 3 to 4 months, which is really quite impressive. Nuclear only produces about 5% of China's energy as it stands today, but that will not be the case in just a few years. It would appear that Beijing see it as an absolute cornerstone in their energy future. True to form, they are building reactors on an assembly line cheaper and faster than Western countries are. Parts of Africa, of course, tell a different story because nuclear, just due to its cost, is not a consideration in many of those countries. They are betting big on solar, as you'd expect. You've got mini grids in Kenya. South Africa's rooftops are dotted with solar panels because they are cheaper and pretty fast to deploy. South Africa does have 2 aging reactors that are still operational, and Egypt has just started work on one that has got ties to Russia. But for most of the African continent, nuclear is not really feasible financially. Smaller island nations, of course, like the Pacific, nuclear just wouldn't be an option for them. They're too small. They've got tiny grids. It just isn't feasible financially or physically, if you like. And a lot of them are dependent on diesel or coal importation, which is a real shame. So again, they're racing towards solar with lots of battery storage. A lot of them are almost at 100% solar too. It's pretty impressive. Storage costs are a problem, you know. Solar, of course, only works during the day, so you need to store it so you can use it at night. But those storage costs pale in comparison to diesel. As I said, back here in Aotearoa, we're running on 85% renewables, which is fabulous, but we do still have Huntley, of course, which burns coal. Hydro dams do more than half of our renewable energy, as you'd expect. Geothermal is about another 1/6, and wind is only about 5%, which actually surprised me. I thought it would be a lot higher. Solar is tiny. It's dismal. We need microgrids. We need more oomph. In places where solar will work, we need more incentives to get it on people's rooftops. Because we've got plenty of flexible hydro, we have the option to build something called pump storage, which is where you use water as a battery, if that makes sense. Nuclear doesn't really work for us. It doesn't really solve a pressing problem. And we are quite literally known as the Shaky Isles. And I don't know about you, but earthquakes and nuclear fill me with confidence. We could just look at Fukushima to see how that goes. We still can't really afford nuclear energy, according to economic analysts. The billions and billions of dollars it would cost to build a plant would take too long to pay off here. So the economics don't stack up. The smart money is on wringing more out of wind, more out of solar, and seeing what we can do to get more out of hydro. Of course, the test in Australia is a bit different. Coal is most of their grid. It's about 60%, and I was really surprised when I read that. The stuff is dirt cheap, it's local, it's going to be very hard to pry out of some of those billionaires' hands. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. The 2025 federal election that was just last week tried to make the nuclear issue a voting issue, and that backfired spectacularly because they had their worst loss, I think, almost in recorded history. And I have to say Australia's election result gave me back a little bit of hope in people. Now, it'd just be really great if the Australian government would stop supporting Israel and supplying weaponry parts. But the coalition's nuclear plan couldn't beat simple maths. Why would you wait 10, 20, 30 years to build these reactors for billions of dollars when the country already has record rooftop solar, some of the best wind sites on Earth, and that would be infinitely cheaper? Right now, more than 1/3 of Australian homes have solar panels on them. That's pretty amazing. And you've got utility-scale solar and wind farms that are queuing up for grid connections to literally get attached to the grid in everywhere from Queensland to Victoria. Storage is the problem as always, but hey, let's just give Elon Musk a call if he's not too busy ruining things elsewhere. Storage is always going to be a problem with electricity, but as always, technology will catch up. If Australia wanted to swing back into nuclear and perhaps look at those small modular reactors, it would need a lot of changes. It would need a shitload of new legislation. It would need a licensing body. It would need specialist skills because, of course, it doesn't have nuclear engineers. And it would need community buy-in, which would be the hardest of all. And people being people, that would be very difficult to do. That is not a quick solution for Australia. Whereas filling the desert with panels and sticking turbines on ridges, much quicker, much easier. No nuclear waste. I was surprised when I started doing this research just how convoluted it was, because I figured that someone somewhere would have a definitive answer for me based on a whole bunch of facts, and I did not find that. Every expert seems to have a slightly different opinion. So I've summarized some of them for you. First up, we have climate scientist Dr. James Hansen. He was the guy who rang the alarm bell in the US Senate back in 1988. He's been pretty blunt about it. He says leaving nuclear power off the table makes keeping warming below 2 degrees practically impossible. He maintains that nuclear is one of the quickest ways to decarbonise. But then you have Stanford engineer Mark Jacobson, who emphatically disagrees. He thinks we can run the world on wind, water and sun. They are cheaper, cleaner, faster, and they don't need nukes at all. He has modelling that shows 100% renewables by mid-century is totally possible if we overbuild wind and solar, back them with storage, and figure out smart demand. Smart demand is simply forecasting where and when you need demand the most. You've got something called the International Energy Agency, and they sit in the middle. Their executive director said last year that extending existing reactors and adding new nuclear where it makes sense can cut costs and speed up net zero, but governments must keep a close eye on budgets and schedules, which is super vague and very much sitting on the fence. Nuclear helps, but only if you build it on time and on budget, which is not something historically that we've done very well. Greenpeace, of course, no surprises, they are very much out. One of their energy analysts calls nuclear a slow, money-eating distraction from the renewables revolution that is already underway. Definitely some point to his argument. Greenpeace argues that for every dollar spent on reactors, could deploy 3 or 4 times more renewable energy. Now, my favourite source for most of this kind of discussion is something called Project Drawdown. If you haven't heard about it, they've analysed and ranked all of the solutions for climate change effectively. That is a gross simplification of what they've done. I really do urge you to go and have a look at their website. But they list nuclear power as useful, but nowhere near the top of the heap. In fact, it's in the bottom half of their solutions. They model 2 scenarios. And across those 2 scenarios, they figure that it will avoid either 9.8 gigatons to 13 gigatons of CO2 by 2050. That's actually not huge, because when you compare that to the number 1 solution that they have ranked, which is food waste, at avoiding 88 to 100 gigatons, I mean, it's okay, but it's not a silver bullet. Nuclear is ranked well below wind, solar, food waste cuts, refrigerant fixes, and many, many others. And again, they simply highlight the same points as everyone else, which is cost, time, complexity, nuclear waste, and the fact that we already have better solutions that we should just pour money into. So that's really clear as mud, isn't it? Yeah, I thought so too. But don't panic, because we're kind of nearly at the end and the answer is in sight. Kinda. Because ultimately the answer as to whether we actually need nuclear energy is it depends. And I actually think that might be the most annoying answer to any question ever. It depends on things like where you live, how fast you need to move, the resources available to you. In theory, we can absolutely run the entire planet on renewables over and over again. We've seen the modelling, it absolutely exists. If you overbuild wind and solar, you lace it together with transmission, you bump it up with storage, you figure out smart demand, you add a bit of hydro, a bit of geothermal. Easy peasy, math says it absolutely works. But when you really look at it, some regions probably don't fit the bill, right? They don't have the land, the water, or the public patience to plaster the landscape with things like wind turbines. And again, people are the problem in this discussion, right? Coal is the easiest choice for a lot of these places. And also, on a cold, dark, creepy night, in some places, you can't really blame them for wanting the easy choice. In those places, a well-run small reactor can shave decades off the decarbonisation time. It's certainly better than coal anyway. A lot of people say, why don't we just fill the desert with solar panels and pipe that electricity back to the dark coal places in the globe? And unfortunately, transmission and storage are actually quite inefficient. We lose a lot of electricity through transmission wires. Can you imagine the amount of cables you would need to transmit all of, say, Aotearoa's energy from whatever the closest desert is? Works okay in theory, definitely doesn't work in the real world. So do we need nuclear? Theoretically, no. I think in reality, probably yes. Even better if nuclear goes from being fission to fusion. And again, if that confuses you, go and have a look at episode 3. If we can build it on budget, we can deal with the waste, and we somehow get people on board, and I firmly believe that that last one is the hardest, it's a fast-acting way in certain areas to avoid boiling the planet. But if we can't, then let's fire up the wind farms. Let's get more solar panels up on people's roofs. Let's find better ways to store energy, which is absolutely happening. Battery tech is light years ahead of where it was even this time last year. But either way, let's just stop talking about it, because it's pretty clear that the absolute worst thing we can do is just keep going on, round and round in circles, debating ideology, which is getting us nowhere. Let's listen to analysts, listen to scientists and experts, people who understand these things, figure out the best mix for wherever we are based in the world, and just do it. Let's just figure it out and crack on. Sometimes I just want to bang our politicians' heads together. That is definitely another episode. Right, well, that's the nuclear series done and dusted, and thank God, because honestly, I was getting kind of bored. But the bottom line is that nuclear is not this universal hero. It's not going to save us all. It's not a silver bullet, but it's also not the killer villain that popular media portrays it as. It's somewhere in the middle. Some grids need it, some grids won't. But wasting time on ideologies about being nuclear-free based on fear is not helpful, because the atmosphere that is slowly, not that slowly, filling with CO2 doesn't care. And it's just an enormous waste of time.